Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jayden Reed, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 13 wide receiver rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about how many points defenses are allowing to opposing wide receivers throughout the spectrum of weeks 6 through 12, because the most recent performances against these defenses are significantly more important in comparison to what happened earlier this year. Then we'll go ahead and transition into talking about my top 43 wide receiver rankings, because again, there are no teams on bye, and there are 4 games between Thursday and Friday of this week. Therefore, we wanted to go ahead and expand the list of wide receivers that we talk about. I will talk about these players on an individual basis. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description of the video like we do in every single video. There are timestamps available there. Again, while you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because besides the weekly rankings videos, we're also live streaming every single day. Tomorrow morning, Thursday morning, on Thanksgiving Day, starting at 7 a.m. PST, I will be live streaming. If you have any questions regarding the lineups, we'll have up-to-date rankings ready to go. So if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. Also, later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming on the channel. So if you have any questions for Week 13 lineups, I'm more than happy to help. Be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about matchups. I think it's plain and simple. We go into further detail regarding all of these potential matchups when we talk about the wide receivers in specific. But of course, I want to go ahead and give an overview in regards to some of the more advantageous matchups. The Atlanta Falcons, Saints, Ravens, Texans, Vikings, the Cleveland Browns, etc., are the most advantageous based on fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers based on receiving statistics, that being half PPR receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Of course, guys like McConkey, Quentin Johnston, hopefully finding himself a bounce-back performance against the Atlanta Falcons defense that have given up 2+ touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks in 9 of the last 10 games. The New Orleans Saints will have their hands full with guys like Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, who are playing at an all-time high level. The Baltimore Ravens, of course, they're taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, so if Devontae Smith and, of course, A.J. Brown are ready to go, should be an exciting matchup for both those wide receivers. But we'll go into even further more detail. I also want to go ahead and highlight some of the more disadvantageous matchups. For example, the Green Bay Packers, they will not have Jair Alexander, which is definitely a benefit for Jaylen Waddle and Tyreek Hill going into the Thursday night game. The Eagles, the Commanders, the Panthers, the Steelers, they are at the top of this overall conversation in regards to some of the more disadvantageous matchups. Now, the Panthers, yes, are in this conversation, but they're primarily in this conversation because typically teams against them are having to run the ball in the second half because they have taken commanding leads. Therefore, it's not really a matter of their secondary playing at an all-time high level, but rather the teams taking them on are running the ball down their throat in the second half rather than being a pass funnel, in comparison to someone like the Baltimore Ravens, who are taking commanding leads and forcing opposing teams to have to throw for a majority of the second half. With this all covered, before I get into my top 43 wide receiver rankings, do want to remind you, if you guys want my all-encompassing rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make that first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, tail the upcoming picks for tomorrow's games, but also go ahead and get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours every single Sunday morning. These rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex in order to help you set your lineups, get you closer to the playoffs, and of course, hopefully capturing a 2024 fantasy football championship. If you're interested, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If you are not eligible based on your current location, or if you've used my code or somebody else's code in the past, you can always check out the rankings and get those available via Patreon. Links also down in the description. Thank you very much. Last but definitely not least, again, for those of you who are new customers, you'll be able to take advantage of the Jordan Love 0.5 total yards play tomorrow by signing up today using code Andrew. So if you're interested, be sure to do so. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about our number 1 wide receiver, Ja'Marr Chase. Look, the top 12 to 20 wide receivers, in my opinion, quite frankly, are just auto starts every single week. But when we're talking about the best wide receiver in fantasy right now, Ja'Marr Chase, who's averaging over 22 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, we know he's an auto start. He's an incredible player. He's coming off of a bye week. He's going to be at a full healthy rate. This offense will hopefully recalibrate and are going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, even though at times the Steelers have been great in terms of their secondary coverage. But even with that being the case, we still anticipate that Ja'Marr Chase is going to ball out like he has had all season long. Hopefully he'll go ahead and put up another great performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers, because the Bengals need it. They're a 4-7 football team. They quite literally need to win 6 games in a row to even give themselves a chance to getting into the wild card conversation for the NFL playoffs. So hopefully they'll string together a victory here and Ja'Marr Chase will put up another great fantasy performance. Number 2 is Nico Collins, who takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Of course, Nico Collins has himself an incredible history of success against the Jacksonville Jaguars, even going back to last year. But earlier this season in week 4, 15 targets, 12 catches, 151 and a receiving touchdown for 27.1 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. That's a scoreline that Nico Collins should have had this most recent week if it wasn't for the touchdown that was called back due to a penalty. That's 2 consecutive weeks in a row in which a touchdown is called back from Nico Collins due to whether it's, an illegal man downfield or most recently Joe Mixon, unfortunately, not getting set prior to the snap. Either way, when you take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 10th best matchup at the position, you were expecting immediate success. We have seen other wide receivers ball out against this defense as of late. We're talking about Smith going for 487 and a touchdown. J-Mo, 4 for 124 and a touchdown. Amon-Ra St. Brown in that same game, 11 catches, 161, 2 touchdowns. We're expecting a lot of high upside here for Nico Collins this week. Number 3, we have Puka Nacua. Look, the fact of the matter is, in the last 4 games in which he has played at a full capacity, 14.6, 14.3, 21.8, 16.2. So basically, Puka Nacua is a 14 to 16 point player in the absence of a touchdown. Otherwise, once he gets that touchdown, we're talking about a 20 to 22 point stud in a half PPR scoring format. Every single week, he's going to have himself the opportunity at a high volume of overall targets. Even with Quinyon Mitchell last week, it did not matter. Of course, going into this week's matchup against the New Orleans Saints, the second best at the wide receiver position, allowing over 32 fantasy points per game. We have most recently seen wide receivers like London and Mooney go for over 95 receiving yards each against them. Elijah Moore, 6 catches for 66 and a touchdown in that same game. Jerry Jeudy, 6 for 142 and a touchdown. We're expecting Puka Nacua to ball out once again this week. Moving on to our number 4, we have A.J. Brown, who takes on the Baltimore Ravens. Look, the Baltimore Ravens are the 3rd best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing nearly 32 fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR. Recently, we have seen Tillman, 7 for 99, 2 touchdowns. Sutton, 7 for 122. Pickens, 8 for 89. Lad McConkey, 6 for 83. We have seen wide receivers deliver on a weekly basis against this defense. So why not one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, especially considering Davante Smith is still dealing with his injury. And earlier today, we did get a confirmation that he was not practicing. So why not talk about a player like A.J. Brown, who's had 100 plus receiving yards in 4 of the last 7 healthy games, to potentially put together a performance similar to that, hopefully accompany it with a touchdown and find himself an abundance of overall upside in what is expected to be the highest scoring game of the week. Number 5, we have Cooper Kupp. Look, if Puka Nacua is going to ball out, so is Cooper Kupp. Taking on the New Orleans Saints is no joke. It is one of the easiest matchups you could possibly ask for. The second best at the position, allowing over 32 fantasy points per game. We talked about it just moments ago with Puka Nacua. If Jeudy, Elijah Moore, London, and Mooney, both duo wide receivers on their individual teams, were both able to find themselves an abundance of success against this New Orleans Saints defense, I'd imagine that Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are the next 2 to find themselves that kind of level of success. Considering Cooper Kupp is coming off of great performances on a consecutive basis, he has scored a touchdown minimum in 4 of the last 6 healthy games he has played within the offense. As long as those opportunities continue to go in his direction, coming off of a week of double-digit targets, we're expecting very much so the same this week against the Saints defense. Beginning the A tier, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is currently dealing with an injury at this current moment in time. And considering the overall turnaround from Sunday's game to a Thursday morning matchup on Thanksgiving Day, it's obviously a short week, and hopefully he is going to be healthy and ready to go. Because, again, this is a matchup he could absolutely take advantage of. If we talk about wide receivers at the slot position against the Chicago Bears over the course of the last 3 games, Minnesota, slot receiving options, 4 catches for 90. Green Bay, 4 catches for 96 and a touchdown. New England, 4 for 50. There's a lot of opportunity for Amon-Ra St. Brown to put together a solid performance, even though he did break his streak with 8 consecutive games of 1 touchdown minimum. Even though that streak has been broken, hopefully he can go ahead and restart the streak and get himself into the end zone. Of course, the workload of opportunity that goes in his direction is at a pretty high level. As long as, of course, this is going to be a competitive game and not a complete blowout, Amon-Ra St. Brown certainly in the top 6 conversation. Moving on to our number 7, we have Justin Jefferson. Look, every season he typically has one of these performances in which he completely disappears, gets himself 1 to 2 catches, 20 to 30 yards. We've got that out of the way, and going into the future, we won't have to expect a performance as such for the fantasy playoffs, which is very promising. But for those of you who rely upon Justin Jefferson every single week, you know he's an auto start. You know he's one of the best, if not the best, wide receiver in the National Football League. Regardless of which defense he plays, he continues to ball out. Unfortunately, coming off of a week in which Hawkinson and Addison were the primary benefactors of the fact that Justin Jefferson was being doubled, if not triple teamed at times. Therefore, going into this week's matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, we're hoping that he's going to get himself a greater share of overall opportunity and won't be ignored as, the Arizona Cardinals potentially could also do the same thing to him where they triple team him and completely take him out of the overall equation. Moving on to our number 8, the thumbnail of today's episode, a wide receiver who has continued to play at a top tier level. From weeks 8 through 12, Courtland Sutton is the number 3 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average, only behind Jamar Chase and JSN. He's averaging 9.6 targets, 7.2 receptions, 93 receiving yards, 0.6 touchdowns, and 17.18 fantasy points per game and a half PPR since week 8. He takes on the Browns, which are the 6th best matchup at the position, allowing nearly 31 fantasy points per game. We have most recently seen wide receivers of the caliber of Flowers, 7 for 115, Johnston, 4 for 118 in a touchdown, MVS, 2 for 87 in a touchdown, and Calvin Austin, 3 for 78 in a touchdown. The majority of the wide receivers I just talked about finding themselves success deep down the field. If we're going to have ourselves an opportunity for Courtland Sutton to go make plays down the field, Bonex throwing the ball in his direction, we're expecting a huge week from him once again. Moving on to our number 9. We have T. Higgins. Over the course of the last 4 games in which he has played, he's averaging 10.5 targets, 7.3 receptions, 98 receiving yards per game, 1 receiving touchdown per game, and 19.38 fantasy points per game. This week, they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers, which again, like I talked about earlier, it's not the easiest overall matchup, but we have seen wide receivers dominate. Jerry Jeudy, 6 catches for 85 in a snow game. McLaurin, 5 for 113. Slayton, 4 for 108. And Nabers in the same game for 7 catches, 71 yards. We're talking about T. Higgins, who last season against the Pittsburgh Steelers in Week 16, 5 catches for 140 and a touchdown for 22.5 fantasy points with a backup quarterback. We're expecting a lot of success this week as the Cincinnati Bengals, backs against the wall, need to go ahead and find themselves victorious against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Moving on to our number 10, we have Drake London, another wide receiver who's coming off of a bye week. In the games this season in which Drake London has played 80% of the snaps or more, so he hasn't been pulled out of the game in the 4th quarter or potentially hasn't gotten injured and left early. In the games in which he has played at a full capacity, he's averaging 9 targets, 6 catches, 69 yards, a half a touchdown per game, and nearly 13.5 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, and has an opportunity of taking on the Los Angeles Chargers this week. Like I mentioned earlier, the Atlanta Falcons secondary, they're allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers. So if we're going to be in a situation in which the Chargers are going to take themselves a commanding lead with the absence of J.K. Dobbins because their running game is going to be lackluster, if they're going to lean upon the passing game, this could potentially be a shootout in which Kirk Cousins has to continue to retaliate against a secondary that, again, is nearly allowing 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I'd expect Drake London off the bye week, healthy, ready to go, to ball out. Number 11, we have CeeDee Lamb. Look, CeeDee Lamb, back-to-back weeks of 12 targets, which is incredible. Regardless of which quarterback sits under center, he's continuing to get himself a high volume of opportunity, which is all that we could potentially ask for because opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And even though the last 2 weeks hasn't led to him potentially finding himself in the end zone, going into this week's matchup against the New York Giants, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could do so. Earlier this season, in week 4, yes, with Dak Prescott at quarterback, 8 targets, 7 catches, 98 and a touchdown for 21.1 fantasy points against the New York Giants. If we're going to give him the opportunity share that he deserves, 12 plus targets, and even more potentially, I'd expect that CeeDee Lamb against the Giants should be able to ball out once again this week. Moving on to our number 12, we have George Pickens, who with Russell Wilson under center. In the last 4 games, 74 receiving yards minimum, 4 receptions minimum. Obviously, this most recent week in a snow game, I don't even want to count that because really, if it wasn't for the fact that it was snowing, George Pickens had beaten the secondary. Remember, he was wide open in the back of the end zone, just couldn't even locate the ball because he couldn't see running down the field with all the snow. So going into this week, we're expecting him to get back on track, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, allowing nearly 28 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We've most recently seen Ladd McConkey go for 6 for 123 against the Bengals. Bateman, 6 for 51 in a touchdown. Myers, 8 for 105. Devontae Smith, 6 for 85 in a touchdown. Wide receivers deliver. Next up is George Pickens. Moving on to our number 13, speaking of Ladd McConkey, he has gotten himself into this conversation because of the opportunity share he continues to get every week. Thus far this season, in games in which he's been given 7 or more targets, is averaging 10.87 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Considering Quentin Johnston has forgot how to catch the ball and they take on the Atlanta Falcons, the best matchup at the wide receiver position. Most recently, wide receivers from Denver went for 19 catches, 260, and 3 touchdowns. New Orleans wide receivers with no Rashid Shaheed or Chris Olave, 6 catches, 153, 2 touchdowns, and even Dallas wide receivers recently, 7 for 141 and a touchdown. The expectation is that Ladd McConkey should have himself another successful week because of the matchup against the Atlanta Falcons and hopefully find himself in the end zone. Moving on to our number 14, we have Malik Nabers. Now, we don't know exactly what the overall situation is within this offense, who's going to be playing quarterback. We know that earlier today, Tommy DeVito did not even practice, much less even travel with the team to Dallas. So there could be a possibility that we get Drew Lock under center, which in my opinion is a better overall potential for Malik Nabers to find himself the overall upside that we're looking for. Back in week 4 against the Dallas Cowboys, that upside looked like 15 total targets, 12 catches, 115 receiving yards. And based on his most recent comments after this most recent game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, hopefully the squeaky wheel is going to get the oil, and we're going to really put that to the test by giving him potentially double-digit targets. If that is going to be in the realm of possibility, taking on the Dallas Cowboys, the 7th best matchup at the position, we would expect that Malik Nabers find himself a lot of success, especially with the quarterback change on hand. Number 15, we have Tyreek Hill. Look, the only thing that concerns me about Tyreek Hill is that, unfortunately, Tua Tagovailoa is going to be put to the test playing in Green Bay this upcoming Thursday night, which is expected to be a game that is going to be freezing. Over the course of Tua's career, in games in which he has played in 40-degree weather or below, he has never captured a victory. He has 6 touchdowns and 6 interceptions in those 4 games in which he has lost. But again, as long as the opportunity is there to throw the ball deep down the field to Tyreek Hill, it only takes one play to find success. Unfortunately for this offense, of course, they take on the Packers, which are the most difficult matchup at the wide receiver position based on the most recent performances against their secondary. Luckily, Jair Alexander is out. But again, we're just hoping for that one singular play to find upside for Tyreek Hill this week. Moving on to our number 16, we have Mike Evans. Look, Mike Evans this last week looked solid. But unfortunately, the game script really just got away from them. After taking a 3-score lead, the running attack really did begin to take over, and because of that, there wasn't as much opportunity for Mike Evans within the red zone. Again, do not forget that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had 4 different players rush in touchdowns: Sean Tucker, Baker Mayfield, Bucky Irving, and Rachaad White. So if we're going to be in a situation this week in which the Carolina Panthers are going to be significantly more competitive than the Giants were last week, which we're hoping for that to be the case, we would hopefully see more opportunities within the red zone for Mike Evans. This most recent week, Baker Mayfield only had 5 attempts inside the 20-yard line. 1 of them went to Mike Evans. 2 of them went to Bucky Irving. So again, when the running back is getting more targets down in the red zone than your number 1 receiving option, you kind of understand what exactly the script was within the overall game. Taking on the Carolina Panthers, J.C. Horn has obviously played well as of late, but expecting Mike Evans to get back on track with another week under his belt, hopefully finding himself in the end zone this week to get himself into this top 20 wide receiver conversation. Moving on to our number 17, Jauan Jennings. Earlier today, we did see promising information regarding Brock Purdy's status. He did get himself a limited participation. He was throwing the ball a little bit on Monday. So if we're going to be in a situation in which he could potentially play, again, Jauan Jennings is an auto start. We talked about it last week. We will continue to talk about it. In games in which Jauan Jennings has played 80% of the snaps or more this season, he's gotten himself 12, 11, and 11 targets in those 3 games. A 31.5% target rate. So that means 1 out of every 3 routes that he's running, he's being targeted when he is on the field with Brock Purdy and ready to go. Therefore, if we're going to be in a situation in which he's active this week against the Buffalo Bills, expect Jauan Jennings to find himself in abundance of overall opportunity and success. Number 18, we have Brian Thomas Jr. Very similar to Jauan Jennings. It's purely just a matter of, is his quarterback going to return? In the event in which Trevor Lawrence does end up practicing this week and returning against the Houston Texans, expect a lot of success, especially considering earlier this year, Brian Thomas Jr. against the Houston Texans, 9 targets, 6 catches, 86 and a touchdown for 18.9 half PPR fantasy points. The Texans are the 4th best matchup at the wide receiver position. We've most recently seen Calvin Ridley, 5 catches, 93, while Tyler Boyd and Nick Westbrook-Ikhine both balled out as well. CeeDee Lamb, 8 for 93. Amon-Ra, 6 for 16 and a touchdown. As long as Trevor Lawrence is back, Brian Thomas Jr., an auto start at a top 18 capacity. Moving on to our number 19, we have DK Metcalf. Now, over the course of DK Metcalf's season, there are going to be the ebbs and flows. There are going to be games in which he finds the high upside of a receiving touchdown down the field because of the deep ball receiving game. Now, again, when we talk about his overall season, in 8 of the 9 games in which he has played, he has had a minimum reception of 22 or more yards. So again, the deep receiving game is continuing to be integrated within his overall workload every single week. It's just sometimes it doesn't lead to a touchdown. Now again, when we look at the number of getting 8 of the last 9 games, 22 yards or more within a singular reception, when I headed on over to Underdog, I specifically went to look at DK Metcalf's number. This week they have it at 19.5 receiving yards in terms of his longest receptions, higher or lower. I'll take the higher on that. If he's done it in 8 of the last 9 games in which he has played, I'm pretty confident there. They take on the New York Jets, who again, their secondary has struggled as of late. Tank Dell went for 6 catches, 126. Marvin Harrison, 5 for 54 and a touchdown. And most recently, Josh Downs, prior to the bye week, 5 for 84 and a touchdown. We'd expect success from DK Metcalf once again this week, and hopefully some deep receptions down the field. Moving on to our number 20, we have DJ Moore. Now, even though DJ Moore has been out-targeted by Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze in the last 2 weeks, DJ Moore is hyper efficient in the overall opportunities that he is given. 7 targets, 7 receptions in the last 2 games with the new offensive coordinator. Going into this week, again, we have to understand that they do take on the Detroit Lions. We do expect the Detroit Lions to take an early lead. And when they do so, it's going to create the passing funnel that exists every single week. The Lions, again, allowing nearly 26 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. Michael Pittman Jr., 6 for 96. BTJ, 5 for 82. Mechie, 5 for 74 and a touchdown. Reed for 5 for 113. Ridley, 10 for 143. We have seen wide receivers ball out every single week against this defense. But the only difference between DJ Moore and someone like potentially Michael Pittman Jr. is that DJ Moore is making majority of his receptions behind the line of scrimmage, or at least close to the line of scrimmage. One of his 7 receptions last week was more than 10 yards down the field. Outside of that, I mean, really, a lot of it is screen passes, bubble screens, catches made behind the line of scrimmage, and allowing him to make plays after the catch, which again isn't great. There could be a week in which he comes out from 7 receptions and only 34 yards if the defense is able to tackle him behind the line of scrimmage on a consecutive basis. But considering the talent he has, the overall potency of the offense as of late, and how well Caleb Williams has looked, specifically this most recent performance, I'm expecting a lot out of DJ Moore this week against the Detroit Lions. Moving on to our number 21, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Jaxon Smith, over the course of the last 2 games, has controlled a 29% target share. As long as he continues to get that healthy target rate, they take on the Jets, who again, most recently, like we talked about with DK Metcalf, have allowed 5 catches for 84 and a touchdown to Josh Downs, 5 for 54 and a touchdown to Marvin Harrison, 6 for 126 to Tank Dell. The Michael Carter matchup against Jaxon Smith-Njigba, considering JSN plays about 90% of his overall snaps within the slot position, it is going to be a tough matchup, but we still expect to see a lot of the potential upside from him once again this week, considering the target opportunity is consistently there as of late. Moving on to our 22, we have Davante Adams. Look, Davante Adams has gotten himself 31 targets in the last 3 games. That is extremely promising, especially when you take on the Seahawks, which is a top 12 matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 28.58 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. We're expecting this game to be a negative game script for the New York Jets offense. Therefore, they are having to throw the ball for majority of the second half. If that's going to be the case, Davante Adams will be benefiting from his overall rapport with Aaron Rodgers and the overall target share as of late. Number 23, we have Terry McLaurin. Look, the absence of overall target opportunity really has been a struggle amongst all top 12 wide receivers thus far this season in terms of total fantasy points scored in a half PPR. Terry McLaurin, even though he's at the middle of the pack, he's like the number 6 overall wide receiver in terms of total fantasy points scored. Amongst the top 12 receivers, he has the least amount of targets and receptions. Again, the target opportunity has not been there, but going into this week with Austin Eckler dealing with an injury, Brian Robinson dealing with an injury, this could be a pass-heavy approach against the Tennessee Titans, especially considering how well the Tennessee Titans have played in terms of stopping the run, most recently shutting down Joe Mixon. So if the Tennessee Titans are going to allow, potential upside to Terry McLaurin, again, we most recently saw Nico Collins, 5 for 92 and a touchdown. JJ, 6 for 81. Addison, 3 for 61 and a touchdown. There could be a potential in which he takes over in the event of a pass-heavy script. Moving on to our 24. We have Marvin Harrison Jr. Look, the lack of opportunity, very similar to Terry McLaurin, has existed for Marvin Harrison Jr. He continues to get himself, opportunities here and there, but not enough to be a solidified start every single week. But luckily this week, they do take on the Vikings. The Vikings are the 5th best matchup. The Vikings most recently allowed from Caleb Williams and the Chicago Bears offense, specifically their 3 primary receivers, DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze combined for 21 receptions, 231 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. We go to the week prior. The Minnesota Vikings allowed 9 catches, 242 and a touchdown to the Tennessee Titans wide receivers. Therefore, Marvin Harrison Jr. hopefully going to find himself an abundance of overall upside this week. He typically is 1 week on, 1 week off. The sequence for this week, he's supposed to be on and have himself a huge performance against Minnesota. Moving on to our number 25, we have Khalil Shakir. Look, Khalil Shakir from week 7 through 11, since coming back from his injury, 9 targets per game, 7.2 receptions per game, 70 receiving yards, and 10.64 half PPR fantasy points per game. But that has been in the absence of Keon Coleman, Amari Cooper, and Dalton Kincaid. If we're going to be in a situation in which those players return, it may lessen the overall target opportunity that Khalil Shakir is exposed to over the course of a game, but he is still clearing away the solidified number 1 target of this offense. And if we're going to be in a situation in which Brock Purdy doesn't play on the other side of the field, if he doesn't play, it's going to be a blowout, and Khalil Shakir is going to benefit from that. And even if Brock Purdy plays, it's going to be a shootout, and he's still going to benefit. Regardless of which way this script goes, expect a lot from Khalil Shakir once again this week. In a full PPR, significantly higher ranked, but in a half PPR, not so much considering he hasn't found the end zone in quite a while. Moving on to our 26, we have Jakobi Meyers. Considering they have named Aiden O'Connell the starting quarterback, we have to remember all of last season at the back end of the 2023 year, Aiden O'Connell, when he took over as the starting quarterback, he continued to funnel targets Jakobi Meyers. And even earlier this year in games in which he has come in and played, Jakobi Meyers had looked solid with him. Jakobi is coming off of a game in which he had 15 targets with Gardner Minshew and Desmond Ridder, but luckily Aiden O'Connell will be able to come and elevate his overall value, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs on Friday. Again, earlier this season, Jakobi Meyers against the Kansas City Chiefs Had himself a receiving touchdown, double-digit fantasy points, had a great week. And that has kind of been the case for a lot of wide receivers against Kansas City as of late. They are the 12th best matchup. Denver wide receivers, 17 for 154 and 2 touchdowns. Buffalo, 17 for 210 and a touchdown. Carolina wide receivers this most recent week, 23 catches for 207 and a touchdown. Expect a lot out of Jakobi Meyers this week. Let's move on to Garrett Wilson. Look, if the target opportunity is not going to be there and the Jets can't get off the tarmac and the Jets offense specifically can't get off to a solid start, they're going to be in a negative game script. And oftentimes, due to that overall situation, Garrett Wilson's double covered. They take him out of the overall equation, and Davante Adams becomes the main benefactor of the overall targets. And that has happened on a consecutive weekly basis. Hopefully, that's not going to be the case coming off of the bye week. They're going to recalibrate, taking on the 11th best matchup at the position. And the offense is going to get Garrett Wilson enough opportunity to make him a relevant fantasy option. But again, I am very worried about the overall situation. If, in fact, this offense isn't able to come out with a hot start, it could be trouble for Garrett Wilson. Moving on to our number 28, we have Darnell Mooney. Now, Darnell Mooney, prior to the bye week, did sustain an injury in the Denver Broncos game. And even earlier today was limited in terms of his overall practice. If, in fact, he is not going to play this week, we'll keep that in mind, but we'll keep an eye on the overall situation as it transpires. But I expect him to play. Thus far this season, in games in which he has had himself 6 or more targets, he's scoring between 7 to 17 fantasy points. We're going to exclude the overall outlier of a 27-point game against Tampa Bay, in which he scores 2 touchdowns. But typically, a solid top 30 wide receiver option. Taking on the Chargers, the 8th best matchup at the position, we have seen wide receivers such as Bateman most recently, 2 catches for 43 and a touchdown. Higgins, 9 for 148 and a touchdown. Chase, 7 for 75, 2 touchdowns. Ridley, 2 touchdowns. Tillman for a touchdown. Olave for over 100 yards. Wide receivers have dominated against the Los Angeles Chargers as of late. As long as Mooney is healthy, ready to go, I expect him to ball out. Moving on to our number 29, we have Calvin Ridley. Look, Calvin Ridley gets himself deep receptions every single week. The opportunity has certainly been there. Over the course of the last 6 games, he has had receptions of 33, 47, 25, 42, 21, and most recently a 63-yard reception in which Levis is able to find him down the field. And as long as Levis continues to throw him, a couple of those deep balls every single game, hopefully once per quarter, Calvin Ridley is going to still be a relevant option, even against a matchup like the Washington Commanders. If Marshawn Lattimore is to return this week, I'd be a little bit more worried about Calvin Ridley. But again, we have seen wide receivers such as Lamb, 10 for 67, A.J. Brown, 5 for 65, Pickens, 5 for 91 and a touchdown, and Malik Nabers, 9 for 59. Again, we haven't really seen a lot of high yardage potential from wide receivers against this defense, but Calvin Ridley with the deep ball receiving game can hopefully unlock that this week within the matchup. Moving on to our number 30, Keenan Allen. Look, Keenan Allen has been dealing with injuries all season long, but now has an opportunity of getting fully healthy, and over the course of the last 2 weeks with the new offensive coordinator getting highly utilized. 23 total targets amongst the 3 Chicago Bears receivers, Odunze, DJ Moore, and Keenan Allen. He is the most targeted receiving option over the course of the last 2 games, coming off of a game of 15 targets, 9 catches, 86 and a touchdown for 19.1 fantasy points. Luckily, again, we are seeing these performances now because the momentum is building going into the Thursday game against the Lions. The Lions run a lot of man coverage. When we're in situations in which Keenan Allen takes on man coverage, he is a significantly more effective wide receiver in terms of yards per route run. Considering how well Caleb Williams played last week, he looked incredible at times in that game. Hopefully, he's able to keep that momentum going into the short week against the Detroit Lions defense. Moving on to our number 31, we have Zay Flowers. Look, Zay Flowers has ebbs and flows. Thus far this season, in the 5 games in which he has 7 or more touches, he's averaging 15 fantasy points per game. Unfortunately, again, they aren't giving him those opportunities because they're oftentimes taking early leads and running out the clock with their great running backs and, of course, with their quarterback at times. Luckily, this week they do take on the Philadelphia Eagles. If the Eagles are going to force them into a position in which, of course, Zay Flowers is going to have to be highly utilized within the receiving game, hopefully, he'll find himself that upside of performance. Even though they do take on the Eagles, which is a difficult matchup, we have seen, this most recent performance of Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, regardless of who's covering them, find success. As long as the opportunities are going to be there, Zay Flowers should find himself success within the given week. Moving on to our number 32, we have Jordan Addison, who has scored a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. And he's coming off of a week in which he had a season high of 9 targets, and obviously was the worst game of Justin Jefferson's season. Justin Jefferson is typically not going to have those games, so don't expect high overall target opportunity for Jordan Addison every single week. But this is definitely a promising enough performance that going into this week, I'm more than happy to start him as a wide receiver 3, taking on the Arizona Cardinals secondary that has played incredibly well as of late. I'd expect that Jefferson and Hawkinson be the primary 1-2 options, and Addison, if he's able to find himself in the end zone, still be a top 36 player. Number 33. We have Jayden Reed. Look, we already know that Romeo Doubs has been ruled out going into Thursday night's game. So that could mean more Christian Watson, Dontavion Wicks, but I'm hoping it's going to mean more Jayden Reed. Again, Jayden Reed primarily playing in the slot position. The Miami Dolphins versus slot receiving options as of late. I mean, the LA Rams, 7 catches for 150 and 2 touchdowns from their slot wide receivers. New England, unfortunately, only 3 catches for 33 this most recent performance. But hopefully, Jayden Reed is going to get back to his normal self, which means scoring touchdowns. Obviously, Josh Jacobs scoring 3 rushing touchdowns last week was out of the blue. But if we're going to be in a situation in which they're going to continue to score at a high rate, the Green Bay Packers hopefully will be looking in the direction of Jayden Reed in the red zone. Moving on to our number 34. Speaking of the matchup of the Green Bay Packers taking on the Miami Dolphins, we have Jaylen Waddle, who's coming off of his best game of the season as of yet, 9 total targets. But like I mentioned earlier with Tyreek Hill, Tua Tagovailoa, in games in which he has played in 40-degree weather or below, he's 0-4. He has 6 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, typically does not play well. There have been games at times that he has played well. Against Buffalo in a weather game when it's snowing, has played incredibly well. But there's also last year's playoff game against Kansas City in which he completely disappears. That is the only risk, on top of the fact that the Packers have played great in terms of their secondary coverage. If Jaylen Waddle's opportunity share does not continue to stay at this number of 8 to 10 targets, I'd expect him to come back down to earth into the wide receiver 3 conversation as our number 34 this week. Moving on to our number 35, Deebo Samuel. Look, Deebo Samuel is 100% going to be touchdown dependent. It's not even a matter of whether or not Brock Purdy plays. Sure, that definitely does help his overall potential for upside, but even if Brock Purdy plays, he still needs a touchdown to be fantasy relevant. Last season, he scored 12 touchdowns in his games. Thus far this season, only 2. So he has a lot of catching up to do. Unless he's going to find himself in the end zone, which again, there's a lot of target competition with Christian McCaffrey back, George Kittle playing like an absolute machine, and of course, Jauan Jennings being the favorite receiving threat of Brock Purdy. Deebo Samuel, kind of the odd man out in this overall conversation. Moving on to our number 36, Tank Dell. Look, the Jacksonville Jaguars secondary can absolutely be taken advantage of. They're the 10th best matchup at the position as they're attempting to try to slow down Nico Collins. Hopefully, CJ Stroud could far more often look in the direction of Tank Dell, who can certainly take advantage of this matchup. We have most recently seen wide receivers like Amon-Ra St. and Jameson Williams both in the same game go for over 120 receiving yards and a touchdown each. Hopefully, Tank Dell can do the same this week with Nico Collins. Moving on to our number 37, we have Jerry Jeudy, who has a revenge game against his former team, the Denver Broncos. Now, in the last 4 games in which he has played with Jameis Winston as the starting quarterback, he has gotten himself a base minimum of 5 receptions and 73 yards per game. These being very promising numbers on top of the fact that outside of a snow game, Jameis Winston is throwing the ball 41 times per game minimum. If we're going to be in a game in which they're airing the ball out, hopefully Cedric Tillman will be available, because if he is, then he'll probably take the coverage of Patrick Surtain, which will allow Jerry Jeudy to be that much more valuable. In the event in which Patrick Surtain is covering Jerry Jeudy for the entirety of the game, it will be a difficult slate of an overall approach. Therefore, I have him at 37 because of my concerns. He has gotten himself a 22% target share over the course of the last 4 weeks, which again is very promising. But then again, it's purely just a matter of who's getting covered by Surtain within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 38, we have Rome Odunze, who's coming off of back-to-back weeks of 10 targets. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, has been number 6 amongst all wide receivers in terms of total air yards. They're allowing to throw the ball down the field in his direction. All he needs is one singular play to find himself upside. Again, we have seen many of wide receivers find success. Michael Pittman Jr. last week, BTJ, Mechie, Reed, Ridley. Over the course of the last 5 weeks, we have seen wide receivers deliver on a consecutive weekly basis. If the opportunity is there in a negative game script, Rome Odunze could absolutely take over on Thursday morning. Moving on to our number 39, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Look, the fact of the matter is, DeAndre Hopkins has back-to-back games of 45% of the offensive snaps. I think it was 45 and 47%. Those are not great numbers. And even though he's being targeted on 22% of the routes that he is running, he only has 10 targets in the last 2 weeks. Unless he scores a touchdown against the Las Vegas Raiders, I would not expect much. Again, we have most recently seen wide receivers like Tyreek Hill, 7 catches, 61 and a touchdown. Courtland Sutton, 8 catches, 97 and 2 touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders. We're hoping for something of a similar performance from DeAndre Hopkins this week. Number 40, we have Michael Pittman Jr. Now, earlier today, the head coach of the Colts, Shane Steichen, did not go ahead and completely rule out Josh Downs in terms of potentially playing. But in the event in which Josh Downs is limited or potentially missing, we'd expect that Michael Pittman Jr. will be the number 1 option. That being said, he will be covered by Christian Gonzalez. So this may end up being a game in which it is all Alec Pierce. Time will tell. But as of right now, Michael Pittman Jr. coming off of his most promising performance in quite a while, 6 catches for 96 with, Anthony Richardson under center. The Patriots technically, as of late, allowing 29.6 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receiver options, the 9th best matchup. If Michael Pittman Jr. can take advantage of the matchup, even with Christian Gonzalez covering him, could be a solid play. Moving on to our number 41, Jameson Williams. Taking on Chicago is a very difficult matchup, but all we need is that one singular play for him to be relevant. Every single week, if he finds himself with a 30-plus yard receiving touchdown, he's going to be relevant. If we get into those kind of sequences in which he's only 5 catches for 50 yards, very similar to last week, in a full PPR relevant, but in a half PPR, obviously leaves a lot to be desired within his performances. Moving on to our number 42, even though Quentin Johnston has forgot how to catch the ball, I expect him to play incredibly well, especially taking on the best wide receiver matchup and, of course, the best quarterback matchup of the week. I'd expect him to bounce back this week. And the final player I wanted to talk about is Davante Smith. He did not practice today. If he's not healthy and ready to go, obviously we forget about him. But if he's able to play this week against the Baltimore Ravens, I'd anticipate that he's still going to be a relevant option, even though he's only getting himself about 5 targets per game as of late. It's still enough opportunity to where hopefully within a potential shootout, he could get himself a little bit more upside, maybe 6, 7, 8 targets, which leads to even more fantasy success, but we'll have to keep his injury monitored. That is why I specifically mentioned him as our number 43. All right, that's going to cover my video today. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll be back later tonight, starting at 7 p.m. PST, and tomorrow morning starting at 7 a.m. PST. If you have any questions, be sure to swing them by. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.